be in relationship with higher education. There's another Watson that's been writing about this lately, the Reverend Dr. Kevin Watson, who is currently at Asbury Seminary and Asbury Church in Tulsa. And this is his recent article, 3 Thoughts on Educational Requirements in the Global Methodist Church. I'm not going to read the whole thing the way that I did David Watson's article, but what's at stake here is early Methodism was not synonymous with higher education. A ton of the circuit riders were doing course of study on horseback. John Wesley would give them a series of books to read. Nobody was made a circuit riding preacher or preacher of any kind in Methodism if they didn't bear fruit. It was much more concerned with this is knowledge I have from Kevin Watson's new history book, that people were not brought into the ministry who had good credentials and educational pedigree. People were made preachers who were good preachers, who were very compelling in their prayers first, and then those good prayers were given a chance to preach. And if their preaching bore fruit in repentance and fervent faith among the listeners, then they were taken under the wing of those who were already doing it, and they were giving a practical education about how to preach well, how to lead religious services and lead people to Christ. And that was the kind of clergy that they had for at least 150 years until Methodism got more established in the United States, became much more associated with cultural respectability, and then was much more concerned with higher education. That's not to say they had no concern for higher education earlier. Asbury, during his lifetime, they tried to start a school under his name. Methodists did value education as a whole, but it wasn't so that we had high-quality clergy so much as we were helping the poor achieve a better means of providing for their families. It was a class concern. That is not the concern with higher education and clergy now. Now, the undergirding presupposition seems to be, if you do not educate clergy in the academy, then their service in the church is going to be substandard. And so how much are we going to normalize, facilitate, even require higher education for those who are going to be in global Methodist pulpits? My position has been that higher education is not nearly as important as we think it is. Dr. Watson here, Kevin Watson, will acknowledge that there's been a ton of corruption and harm done in higher education, but even so, he is of the mind, and I've sent him a message asking if he'll talk with me about this publicly. He's of the mind that higher education can be much more of a benefit than a harm to the clergy, and that the GMC is not doing right by lowering standards and making things easier to get credentialed in the GMC and avoid the academy. So let's get into that a little bit. He says, I've been tracking the education requirements for ordination in the GMC since the denomination's beginning. In conversations in the church and in the academy, I see some consequences of decisions in the GMC has made that I'm not sure are recognized for a variety of stakeholders. This post is specifically about the requirements for theological education in the GMC. This is not a major emphasis of mine here. I'm writing this post because I've been thinking about this quite a bit of late and wonder if I may be seeing some things that would be helpful to name. The overall intent of this post is to flush out what I think are some unexamined assumptions in hopes that it might help both the GMC as an institution and individuals pursuing ordination in the GMC. To be clear, I am operating on the assumption that the GMC is operating in good faith and doing the very best that they can. So I think he's saying that so that people are not feeling personally affronted, like he's alleging that they're intentionally harpooning anything. He thinks they have good intentions, but we might not be seeing some important things. So he begins with a summary of my understanding of ordination itself and the educational requirements for ordination in the GMC to provide some context. First, one can be an ordained deacon in the GMC after completing 10 required courses. All 10 courses are required. There are no electives. Second, all elders have been ordained a deacon. If one is called to be an ordained elder, one must first complete all requirements to be ordained a deacon and be ordained as a deacon. One then must complete 10 additional required courses. 8 of these 10 courses are required for all elders. 2 additional courses must be taken from a choice of, I think, 12 elective options. He's describing the system for all elders, including me. I was ordained a deacon and then immediately an elder That can't happen anymore. Now you have to be a deacon for, I think, 2 years before you can be an elder. All elders have been ordained deacons. Not all deacons will become elders. This is following historical precedent, but that's another post. So 10 required courses for ordination as a deacon, 10 additional courses for ordination as an elder, 20 courses total to be ordained an elder. These courses do not have to be taken from one institution. Here's where the rubber hits the road for him. And they do not have to be in the same level academically. Prospective ordinands can take courses in an, quote, alternative educational pathway. That's the GMC's language, which is like what course of study was and is in the United Methodist Church, where they can take accredited master's level courses from a list of approved schools. Okay, that's the basic context or background. Here are some implications I see that are significantly different from the way the process worked in the UMC. First, in my opinion, the GMC has created a disincentive for people to complete accredited master's degrees. So I said I'm not going to read the whole article. I'm going to summarize what he says. And then if I do it badly, then he's going to get angry and he has to come on and correct me. So I should intentionally do a bad job at this. What I took him to be saying is, if you make it possible so you can mix and match between institutions of varying quality and caliber, and you can shoot for the cheapest option, then that means that you're going to have very checkered and substandard educations given. So you're going to be undercutting the places that cost the most. Just happen. I think this would be the inference. I don't think he would say 1-to-1, but at least in the case that he represents, Asbury Seminary is more expensive than a lot of other options. A lot of people are going to choose not to go to Asbury now because there are cheaper options that might be easier to work with, and that will be actually harming them and the average quality of the education given. So it's not that anybody has bad intentions here, but what they've done is they've created a system with incentives to lowball as much as possible the quality of the education given those who go through the system. So dealing with the cons, he says, there are a few cons. The academic quality of the various options will vary quite a bit. If someone takes a non-accredited course of study type class for one class and an accredited master's level course for another class, they're getting a significantly different educational experience across the classes. Another con is that the GMC approach will hurt seminaries. Seminaries are expensive, and the current models are not built on guessing which a la carte classes students not enrolled as degree-seeking students might want to take any given semester. So this is one of the things where Methodists need to decide, how strongly do we feel about having our own seminary, supporting the current seminaries. In particular, Kevin Watson, I read another thing he wrote the other day. Asbury is a very high-quality institution. And I know that I was recently poking at them because they did this kind of safetyism mail out in response to some evangelists that came through that were really inappropriate in some ways. But in general, like, they're very clear on their theology, where they stand against the culture, and they're very clear about when they bring staff and new faculty on board, making sure that they are on board and that everybody's going to toe the line around biblical morality. And do we really want to do things that can hurt institutions like that and potentially supplant them, not with another place of similar quality, but a place that can undercut them financially because they're based on a different model? So I haven't heard him call out any other institutions that do that, but it would be kind of silly for us to imagine that no institutions do that. I don't know. I know originally there were 6 higher educational bodies that the GMC acknowledged as valid for training our clergy, but only 3 of them have articulated much theology on biblical morality and how it is that they're going to train their students. And so there is a legitimate concern about, okay, how high are we going to maintain the bar for our clergy? And then, my concern, Watson doesn't articulate this, I don't think. I don't want there to be any kind of notion that once you have completed some degree program and checked off those boxes that you are entitled to ordination or service within this body. And of course, I think almost everybody would say that that doesn't happen. They can go through all this and still not be ordained. But I think anytime you have a program like this that is compulsory rather than optional, you do kind of create this notion of entitlement. You also create here. This is in this article that Watson wrote. I think we're going to be done reading the actual text. He highlights how this recreates when you have high quality institutions and low quality institutions, or ad hoc stuff, that you create a two-tiered system in the denomination, very much as what was seen in the UMC. In the UMC, you had ordained elders, and then you had local licensed pastors. I was a local licensed pastor with a seminary degree from one of their most prestigious institutions. Um, but they create this two-tiered system, and in the GMC, we're saying we're not going to do that, but then we're allowing people to get widely disparate educational experiences in these different academic environments. And so Watson is, I think rightly, warning that we're having good intentions with a thought towards lower income people and people with families and complicated lives. Are trying to make it easier for them. But then there's the law of unintended consequences. He doesn't cite that. I cite that. That seems to undergird a lot of his concern where, okay, we have good hearts in all this, but the long-term implications of GMC with respect to higher education seems to set us up for lower quality clergy and a tiered clergy system where the churches of means are going to prefer those who got the right degree and from the right institution. And when we're allowing clergy to set themselves up for failure and inequality in that way, it's going to cause long-term resentment and dysfunction. So he doesn't summarize it in those ways. That's my language. But this is one of those things where, I mean, the more fundamental thing is, how much are we going to value higher education? And Kevin Watson, I think, would say, when it's done right, higher education is a huge asset to the church, and we are totally right to make ordained eldership and diaconal ministry synonymous with a certain degree and quality of training. I'm not there right now. And it's based partly on stuff that Kevin Watson has said, but I think the strongest that Methodism has ever been was when it was unconcerned with conventions of the academy and when it was only concerned with zeal, whether or not it was perfectly formulated. And whenever we're dancing on that line between extremes of heresy and biblical fidelity, I think that was a huge strength for us. And reading early Methodist history, it feels much more like the Wild West because you couldn't ensure certain standards of academic prowess. That's much more exciting, and you saw much more dynamism in that. So I would much rather have that than a system where we're trying to funnel everybody through these institutions. Because here's the thing about institutions. This is something I want to put to Watson. They change. You know, we saw that at the top of the hour. I talked about that with the Democratic Party. Oh, and I didn't even talk about the Republican Party, which has also massively shifted in the last few years. We've talked about that with respect to the United Methodist Church and how much that's radically shifted. And then with respect to Asbury, WBS, Mid-Christian, Mid-America Christian, all these other institutions, they can change. They might be solid today, they might be solid next year, but they can change. And that means that we can be co-opted. You know, so I just think, you know, what is it? Semper reformanda? Is that the always reforming? We always have to be scrutinizing every part of the church. There's nothing we can take for granted. What are the key foundational things that we're always protecting? I'm just declaring war on this mentality of phoning it in and just trusting that, oh, we can always trust this guy. We can always trust this institution. We can always take for granted it's going to go well here. I just think that's going to get us killed. I think the New Testament witness and the historical reality is we have to be vigilant. We have to watch over one another with love because all of us can be co-opted. And even the biggest, mightiest force for good can be co-opted by the evil one if we let it. So there has to be a vigilance there. Now, am I saying that there is no role for higher education? No. I think we have to have doctors of the church. But I think we always have to be clear about who's in charge. And it's not the academy. And the academy is here to serve the local church. But the moment that we make the academy essential for serving the local church, that's when I think we've gone too far. So I could be changed on this. It could be that Watson and others are able to talk me down from my extremist position. But even so, I sense that the Methodists are still way off kilter about higher education. And I'm glad that Dr. Watson is leading this conversation because I think it volunteers more fundamental questions about, okay, if the academy really is that important, can we talk about how and why? What's the worst case scenario if we don't have the academy in the right position? Is that really the biggest problem that we need to worry about? These are good questions. So I very much appreciate Dr. Watson asking those questions. I'll look at comments one more time and then we'll pray and close for today. John says, but Muslims have to be willing to live alongside others too, though. Well, yes. 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 Islam desires dominance, though not all Muslims follow that idea. Yeah, no, let me just be clear. I'm not a big fan of Islam at all. And I fully acknowledge that there are wonderful Muslims in the world, and I acknowledge that, like I acknowledge there are wonderful Mormons in the world. They're part of a false faith that is an insult to the Lord, and if people remain in that faith, there is no salvation there. So, yeah, our role towards them is not tolerance, it's conversion. Not by force. I just don't think forceful conversion really works. But yeah, if people are going to enter into our societies, they have to naturalize and they have to deal with us. Otherwise, they got to go. D says, so then the original standard for clergy was how well they evangelized and preached and how effective they were at discipling and then how effective they were at helping the membership do the same. Yes. Yes, categorically, without, yes. Yeah. And then she says, education does not guarantee appointment or ordination. Doug says, I don't know that I'm expecting to get much from seminary. Granted, only a few months in, but I have learned more preparing for sermons, classes, or roles in the church than what I see in the curriculum. Yeah, the best education is on-the-ground education, 100%. I did 3 years at Boston University School of Theology. I'm glad for many of the things that I learned there, but there's nothing I learned there that I couldn't have learned on my own. And so I think it should be normative for churches to expect pastors to spend a lot of time in study and personal growth, not necessarily go into like classes, but just learning Greek and Hebrew and doing a lot of reading through commentaries and then being a part of small groups with other clergy, figuring out our doctrine of how it is that we lead people to Christ. Those are the things that add to growth. But there are tons of people who sit in seminaries are morons, absolute morons. Tim says Christian ed needs to rethink accreditation. We need to submit to the world's view of what constitutes quality. We tend to submit. We do this so that our students can get government grants. I'm in favor of moving things more in-house. Yeah, and where things get really complicated is when you're talking about grants and scholarships. I'm increasingly of libertarian sympathies, and when you look at what happens whenever you offset costs, is you create perverse incentives. And so I wonder what Watson would do, Kevin Watson, with, what happened in the United Methodist system is we threw all this money at seminaries to offset the cost of a theological education, but then those seminaries used it to hire additional faculty and staff to then re-socialize the students more. And then it maintained its expense. And then they say, this is a higher quality, this is what we do with higher quality institutions. This is what you're still paying for. And so I'm not sure what to do about the money component, but you're right. The monetary incentives thus far have made theological education much more worldly than it should be.